The same parents who cut me off at 18 were smiling at me across a polished courtroom table, as if nothing had ever happened. Their hands were folded, their posture relaxed, confident. After all, my billionaire grandfather was gone, and they believed his entire empire was finally within reach. I sat there silently, my pulse steady, listening to my mother whisper, "Of course, we'll manage everything for you, Naomi," like I was still a child, like I hadn't survived years without them, like I hadn't learned exactly who they were. They didn't ask how I felt. They didn't apologize. They didn't even pretend to remember the night they told me I was on my own, with nothing but a suitcase and a locked front door behind me. To them, this wasn't a reunion. It was a transaction. They were already spending the money in their heads. $3.8 billion. They thought I was too weak to control. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had planned for this moment. I grew up in a house where money was never discussed as a limitation, only as a reward. From the outside, my family looked perfect. Large home, private schools, dinners where my parents spoke proudly about values and discipline. People admired them. Neighbors complimented how well-raised we were. No one ever questioned whether love inside that house came with conditions, but it did. In our family, affection was earned. Approval had a price tag. And money wasn't just currency, it was leverage. My older brother, Daniel, learned that early. He was everything my parents admired. Confident, outspoken, endlessly certain of his own importance. Even when he failed, it was framed as potential. When he succeeded, it was proof that my parents had done everything right. At dinner, Daniel talked. My father listened. When Daniel bragged about business ideas, he barely understood. My father nodded like he was hearing a future CEO speak. When he talked about wanting more money, more power, more recognition, my mother smiled proudly, as if ambition itself were a moral virtue. I sat across from them, quietly pushing food around my plate. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't lazy. I wasn't reckless. I was observant, thoughtful. I asked questions instead of accepting answers I didn't believe in. And somehow that made me the disappointment. Whenever I spoke about books I loved or ideas that interested me, my mother tilted her head and said, "That's nice, Naomi," in a tone that made it clear the conversation was already over. My father barely looked up. To them, curiosity wasn't strength, it was inefficiency. The real divide became impossible to ignore once money entered the picture. Daniel turned 17 and received a brand new car, parked in the driveway with a bow on the hood. Everyone laughed and took photos. I remember my mother hugging him and saying, "This is an investment in your future." When my 18th birthday came around, there was no car, no celebration, just a quiet reminder that I needed to start being realistic. Daniel's college tuition was paid without question. Mine came with conditions. What's your plan? What's the return? What if you don't finish? When I asked carefully, quietly why things were so different, my father's face hardened. "Daniel understands the real world," he said. "You're too emotional, too sensitive. You expect things to be handed to you." That was the first time I realized something fundamental. In their eyes, I wasn't an investment. I was a liability. By the time I turned 18, the decision had already been made. They didn't argue. They didn't yell. They sat me down at the kitchen table like executives finalizing a contract. "You're an adult now," my mother said calmly. "It's time you learned to stand on your own." No mention of Daniel. No explanation of why he was still supported while I was being cut loose. The message was clear. Independence wasn't a value, it was a punishment. That night, I packed a single suitcase, 2 changes of clothes, a few personal items they never cared about anyway. My parents stood in the hallway and watched. Not cruel, not emotional, just detached. When the front door closed behind me, the sound echoed louder than any argument we'd ever had. Standing on that porch, gripping the handle of my suitcase, I didn't cry. I understood. I understood that in my family, love was conditional and I had failed the conditions. The only person who never looked at me like I was a mistake was my grandfather. William Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't boast about his wealth, and he certainly didn't need to remind anyone who he was. While my parents used money to control the room, my grandfather used silence. He watched, he listened, and somehow He always seemed to understand what people were really saying, especially when they thought they weren't saying anything at all. After I was cut off at 18, I didn't tell him right away. Pride kept my mouth shut. Shame filled in the gaps. But he noticed anyway. He was the one who called me first, his voice steady and unhurried. "Naomi," he said, as if nothing in the world could ever rush him. "Come have dinner with me tonight." I tried to make excuses. Work, homework, anything to avoid admitting the truth. He didn't argue. He just paused and said, "I'll be here." When I arrived, he didn't ask where I was living. He didn't ask why I looked so tired. He simply poured me a glass of water, set a plate in front of me, and let the silence do its work. Eventually, I broke. Not with tears, with exhaustion. I told him everything I'd never said out loud, the lectures, the comparisons, the way Daniel was always treated like a future worth funding, while I was treated like a risk they couldn't afford. I expected disappointment, or pity. Instead, my grandfather leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. "So," he said, "they finally showed you who they are." That was it. No outrage, no shock, just confirmation. From that point on, he became my quiet refuge. I stayed on his couch more nights than I can count. He never called it charity, never made me feel small. He'd hand me grocery money like it was the most normal thing in the world and say, "Everyone needs a little help sometimes. Don't confuse that with weakness." Where my parents saw hesitation, he saw patience. Where they saw sensitivity, he saw perception. "You notice things," he once told me while we played chess late at night. "That makes people uncomfortable, especially people who rely on control." He never spoke badly about my parents, but he didn't defend them either. And that silence spoke louder than any condemnation. As years passed, I built my life piece by piece. Nothing glamorous, nothing flashy. And every step of the way, my grandfather watched quietly from the sidelines, never interfering, never directing, just observing. Sometimes, I'd catch him studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not pride, not concern, calculation. At the time, I thought he was just an old man reflecting on the past. I didn't realize he was looking ahead. And I had no idea that while my parents had written me off as a loss, my grandfather was doing something very different. He was preparing. When my grandfather died, the world didn't stop, but something inside me did. William Carter had been a constant presence in my life for years, quiet and immovable, like a landmark I never questioned would always be there. Even when his health began to decline, I convinced myself he had time. Men like him always did. They survived recessions, betrayals, wars. They didn't simply disappear. So when the lawyer called, his voice careful and formal, I already knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "I'm sorry for your loss, Naomi." The grief came later. What arrived first was numbness. I flew in for the will reading 2 days later. I wore black not because anyone told me to, but because it felt wrong not to. Sitting alone in the back seat of the car on the way to the courthouse, I told myself not to expect anything. A watch, a letter, maybe one of his old chess sets. That was it. I wasn't naive enough to imagine more. My parents were already there when I walked in. They looked revitalized. My mother stood up immediately, her face softening into something that might have passed for warmth if I didn't know her so well. She reached for my hands like we were reuniting after a misunderstanding instead of years of silence. "Naomi," she said gently, "I'm so glad you came." My father nodded, his lips already curved into a smile that sat too comfortably on his face. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, surveying the room like he was assessing a purchase. No condolences, no apologies, just anticipation. As we took our seats, my mother leaned toward me and lowered her voice. "This must be overwhelming for you," she said. "But don't worry, we'll take care of everything." Take care of everything. The phrase sat heavy in my chest. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading. Legal language filled the room: assets, holdings, valuations, numbers so large they felt abstract. Daniel's foot bounced under the table. My father's eyes sharpened with every sentence. Then the words shifted. "Per the wishes of William Carter," the attorney said, "the entirety of his estate, valued at approximately $3.8 billion, is to be transferred to his granddaughter." I stopped breathing. Naomi Carter. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. My father smiled wider. Daniel let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Well, my father said casually, folding his hands together. That makes sense. I like the talk it is an imitation. It never seated video studio. My mother squeezed my arm. Of course it does, she added. You were always close to him. Close. They hadn't said that word in years. And naturally, my father continued, already leaning forward, we'll manage it for you. An estate like this needs experience. Structure, oversight, Daniel smirked. Yeah, Naomi. This kind of money destroys people. They were so sure. So relaxed. So completely convinced the decision had already been made. I looked down at my hands, resting quietly in my lap. They didn't notice that the attorney hadn't finished reading. They didn't notice the way he paused just briefly before turning the page. And they certainly didn't notice the faint, knowing expression on his face. Because while my parents were already dividing control in their heads, my grandfather's real intentions were still waiting to be revealed. The moment the attorney paused, my parents leaned in closer toward me, not him. That told me everything. My mother's hand slid over mine, light but deliberate, like she was reclaiming something she believed belonged to her. You must be in shock, she said softly. Anyone would be. I didn't pull away. I didn't speak. I let her continue. This is far too much responsibility for one person, my father added, his tone calm, reasonable, the same voice he used when he wanted something to sound like a favor instead of a demand. Your grandfather meant well, Naomi. But managing an estate of this size requires experience, judgment. Daniel laughed under his breath. No offense, he said, finally uncrossing his arms. But you still rent. You've never even managed a real investment portfolio. This isn't a starter account, it's an empire. There it was. Not concern. Not love. Assessment. They weren't asking if I wanted help. They were deciding how to take control without calling it that. My mother tilted her head, her eyes glossy with manufactured empathy. You've always been sensitive, she said gently. And that's not a bad thing. But money like this, it breaks people. We don't want to see you ruin your life. Ruin my life. The same people who had watched me leave their house with a single suitcase were suddenly worried about my well-being. I finally looked up. Ruin it how? I asked quietly. They exchanged glances quick, practiced. Well, my father said, bad investments, emotional decisions, trusting the wrong people. He smiled, as if he were listing unavoidable facts. We'd set up proper safeguards, trustees, oversight. In our name, Daniel added easily. Just temporarily, temporary. Like the way they'd temporarily cut me off at 18. My mother squeezed my hand again. Harder this time. You don't need to prove anything, she whispered. Let us handle the pressure. That's what family is for. Family, the word felt foreign in her mouth. I could feel the walls closing in, not physically, but strategically. They were building a narrative right in front of me. Naomi is overwhelmed. Naomi is inexperienced. Naomi needs protection. And the worst part? They believed it. They believed that if they spoke confidently enough, calmly enough, the outcome would bend in their favor. That I would nod. That I would hand over control out of fear or gratitude. The attorney cleared his throat again. But my parents didn't notice. They were too busy explaining my own life to me, too busy reaching for power they were certain was already theirs. They had no idea they were speaking too soon, because my grandfather hadn't finished talking. And the next page of the will was about to tear their version of the story apart. The room had grown quiet, but not the respectful kind. It was the kind of silence that comes when people believe the decision has already been made. My parents leaned back in their chairs, their bodies loose, satisfied. Daniel tapped his fingers against the table, bored now that the hard part was over. To them, this meeting was just a formality. The attorney didn't sit back with them. He remained standing. He adjusted his glasses, glanced once, just once in my direction, and then looked back down at the document in his hands. If everyone will allow me to continue, he said calmly. My father waved a dismissive hand. Of course, just the technicalities, right? The attorney didn't respond. He turned the page. The sound was soft, barely audible, but it landed like a gunshot. There are, he said, carefully, additional provisions attached to Mr. William Carter's estate. My mother's smile faltered, not fully, just enough for a crack to show. Additional? She repeated lightly. I'm sure that's nothing unusual. The attorney read on. Mr. Carter anticipated that his inheritance might be contested. That word snapped Daniel's attention back to the table. Contested? My father echoed, sitting upright now. By whom? The attorney didn't answer him. He continued reading. In the event that any individual, including immediate family, attempts to interfere with, manage, restrict, or assume authority over the estate on behalf of Naomi Carter. My mother's hand slipped off mine. Such actions will be considered a direct violation of the will. The air in the room shifted. Daniel laughed sharply. That's ridiculous. The attorney didn't look up. Furthermore, he continued, his voice steady, Mr. Carter specified that no trustees, guardians, or external managers were to be appointed. The estate is to remain under the sole and exclusive control of Naomi Carter. My father stood up. That's not reasonable, he said, his calm finally cracking. She's not equipped for this. The attorney raised a finger, not sharply, but decisively. I'm not finished. My mother's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The attorney took a breath and read the final paragraph. I leave my estate to Naomi because she has lived without my money and learned its value. If my son and daughter-in-law attempt to take control of what is not theirs, it will prove exactly why they were never chosen. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my father slammed his hand on the table. This is manipulation, he snapped. He's turning her against us. Daniel pushed back his chair. This has to be challenged. You can't just hand a fortune like this to someone who— Who what? I asked. My voice cut through the room, sharper than I expected. They all turned to look at me. For years, I continued, standing now. You told me I wasn't capable, that I was too emotional, too risky, and now you're angry because someone finally disagreed with you. My mother rushed to her feet. Naomi, sweetheart, this isn't about that. Your grandfather was sick. He was influenced. No, the attorney said calmly. He was precise. Silence fell again. The attorney closed the file. These provisions are legally binding, he said. Any attempt to override them will result in immediate disinheritance and potential legal consequences. My parents stared at him like they'd been struck. Their confidence collapsed in real time. My mother's hands trembled. My father's face darkened with rage. Daniel looked at me, not with superiority anymore, but with disbelief. They had come to that room smiling. They had come expecting control. Instead, they were leaving with nothing. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being pushed aside. I was the one standing. While they realized too late that my grandfather hadn't just left me his fortune, he had left me the final word. They didn't accept it. I knew they wouldn't. People like my parents never believe the first no applies to them. To them, rules were flexible, especially when money was involved. Especially when they believed authority was their birthright. 2 weeks later, I was served papers. My father was petitioning the court to place my inheritance under temporary guardianship, citing emotional instability, lack of financial experience, and my personal favorite, a demonstrable history of poor judgment. I read the words twice, then laughed once. Short, humorless. So, this was their next move. The courtroom was colder than the conference room where the will had been read. Less polished, less forgiving. My parents arrived early, seated together like a united front. My mother wore soft colors, the kind meant to suggest concern. My father sat stiffly, jaw tight. Daniel flanked them, arms crossed, eyes flicking toward me with open hostility. They weren't here to reconcile. They were here to erase me. When the judge entered, the room rose. And when we sat again, my father's attorney began painting a picture of me that barely resembled a human being. She is overwhelmed, he said. Isolated, easily influenced. This level of wealth poses a serious risk to her well-being. I listened quietly as years of dismissal were repackaged into legal language. Then it was our turn. My attorney stood slowly, calm, prepared. He didn't argue feelings. He argued facts. He presented emails where my parents referred to the estate as ours, bank records showing attempted inquiries made on my behalf without my consent, text messages from Daniel calling me a temporary obstacle. With each document, my parents shifted in their seats. Finally, my attorney addressed the will itself, William Carter anticipated this exact scenario, he said, holding up the document. That is why he included explicit language prohibiting interference. This petition is not concern, it is confirmation. The judge looked down at my parents for a long moment. Then she spoke. This court will not rewrite a man's legacy because it makes others uncomfortable, she said evenly. The petition is denied. My mother inhaled sharply. My father's face drained of color. The judge wasn't finished. Further attempts to undermine Miss Carter's autonomy may result in sanctions. The gavel came down. It was over. As people stood and began to file out, my mother reached for me, her voice trembling. We only wanted to protect you. I met her eyes for the first time in years. No, I said quietly. You wanted to control me. She had no answer for that. I walked out of the courtroom alone, not because no one followed me, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone to. The court ruling didn't just end the case, it exposed them. In a town where reputation was currency, my parents had spent decades building theirs carefully, obsessively. Charity galas, business lunches, quiet bragging disguised as concern. They were the kind of people others trusted because they looked respectable. That illusion didn't survive the courtroom. Word spread fast. It always does. Not the version they would have preferred, but the truth. People whispered about the petition, about how a father had tried to have his own daughter declared unfit to control her inheritance, about how a billionaire grandfather had anticipated it and written protections specifically against his own son. My mother's invitations slowed, then stopped altogether. The women who once leaned toward her at luncheons now smiled politely and excused themselves early. Concern turned into distance. Distance turned into silence. My father's world fractured more visibly. Clients asked questions. Partners hesitated. The same confidence that once impressed people now looked like arrogance, especially after it failed so publicly. Within months, he was stepping back. That was the phrase they used. But everyone knew what it meant. Daniel unraveled fastest. Without my parents' certainty propping him up, he didn't know where to stand. The golden child image cracked under scrutiny. People who once laughed at his jokes stopped returning calls. Opportunities dried up. The confidence that had always come so easily to him curdled into bitterness. He cornered me once outside a cafe, of all places. You think you won? He snapped. You think this makes you better than us? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I think it makes me free, I said. He stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. And that was the moment I knew the shift was complete. I didn't change my lifestyle overnight. No headlines, no extravagant displays. I invested quietly, learned deliberately, surrounded myself with people who didn't see me as an asset to manage. That terrified my parents more than anything else, because they could no longer reach me through money. They couldn't scare me with withdrawal. They couldn't rewrite the narrative. They had lost the one thing they'd always relied on, control. And as they faded into the background of my life, I realized something quietly powerful. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped letting them take from me. Months later, I drove past my parents' house for the first time since everything ended. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The paint along the shutters was peeling. The lawn was overgrown at the edges, like no one cared enough to keep up appearances anymore. The porch light was on, but the warmth it once projected felt hollow, performative, like everything else they'd ever shown the world. I didn't stop the car. For years, that house had represented failure to me, rejection, the moment I learned how conditional love could be. But as I passed it, I felt nothing pull at my chest. No anger, no sadness, not even triumph, just distance. People assume inheriting billions changes you overnight, that it turns you into someone else. But the truth is quieter than that. Money doesn't build you, it only amplifies what's already there. What changed my life wasn't the $3.8 billion. It was the moment I realized no one could threaten me with abandonment anymore. My grandfather understood that. He didn't leave me his fortune to make me powerful. He left it to make me untouchable, by the people who had spent my entire childhood deciding my worth for me. He gave me something far more valuable than money. He gave me proof. Proof that I had survived without them. Proof that I was never the liability they claimed I was. Proof that I didn't need to beg for a place at any table ever again. As I drove on, the house disappeared in my rearview mirror, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was finally moving forward, on my own terms.